Hello there. Welcome to the show. I'm joined by Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. Eric, great as always to catch up with you. I'm almost a little bit nervous too, though, just because a lot happens in a week's time, and you and I are faced with the dilemma. What do we begin with? It's a
Yeah,
target-rich
sometimes
environment.
sometimes too much happens in just a week's time. One of the things that's been happening lately, which I'm sure you've been following, is the explosive increase in the market value of precious metals, gold and silver. It's really quite something. Gold is now pushing $4,200 an ounce, which is just surreal. And silver is well over $50 an ounce now. And a good way to understand what that means is that it's a measure of the devaluation of the dollar of paper currency, of fiat money. And it's very alarming because this increase seems to be accelerating. It's a clue that there's something very amiss with the dollar, and people should take this into account, including myself. If you've got paper dollars in the bank, digits in this bank, you might want to think about what's going to happen to them potentially in the very near future if this trend continues. You might have, say, $1,000 in the bank, and it could turn out a couple of weeks from now that $1,000 is really only worth $200. That sort of thing has happened before, and it appears to be happening again.
I know we think we're immune, but having talked to people who lived, for instance, in the former Soviet Union, when they underwent some very sudden radical changes in their government, they may have had, take for example, 2,500 rubles sitting in the bank, which at the time, well, you could buy a good used car for 2,500 rubles. But when it was done, when government had shifted and, oh, look, we have a new monetary instrument now, a new currency, suddenly that 2,500 rubles would buy you a t-shirt.
Yeah, absolutely. The paper money, fiat currency, it's ephemeral. The term fiat means essentially what it sounds like. It's simply issued by fiat. It has no underlying intrinsic value. And it's easy to create as much of it as you like because it's made of something that's fundamentally valueless. A piece of paper, or it doesn't even have to be that, excuse me, anymore. It can just be ones and zeros on a screen somewhere. Whereas, one of the great virtues of precious metals is that it's very difficult to simply conjure more of them out of thin air. And that is a safety check on inflation when it comes to money that is translatable into precious metals. And that's one reason why it's a sound thing to have some of, or anything else, frankly, that's of intrinsic value, land, for example, or ammunition, if you want to go that way, or anything that, in and of itself has value to people. A piece of paper money only has value for as long as people think it has value. And the only reason they think it has value is because they think they can get something else for that dollar.
I know people will think, you've watched Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome too many times, but I'm a believer in the barter economy. And I believe that a wise person will have barterable goods. For some people, that might be freeze-dried coffee. I mean, even if you're not a coffee drinker, trust me, the people who are coffee drinkers would probably trade you, some pretty good wampum,
Mhm.
if you happen to have access to that. Alcohol is another thing. And again, I'm not trying to encourage people, hey, go become an alcoholic, but people will want those things. And if you have the foresight to put some of those things away during times of plenty, I think it would probably, I don't think you would regret it at the very least.
I don't think so either. And I think you raise an interesting point. I don't think it's necessarily so much the Mad Max aspect of it. It's a way for us to wrest control away from these manipulators of money. Barter is real. You have something to offer, coffee in your example, that your neighbor might want, and your neighbor in turn has something to offer you that's of actual value. And there's no intermediary. One of the things that besets us, that we suffer from, is that money is no longer a medium of exchange. It's become a commodity in itself that's being manipulated by entities such as the Federal Reserve banking system and the people who are close to that, and have the ability to profit off of us by manipulating money as a commodity via things like inflation, via things like altering interest, which is another way to just take money out of your pocket and mine. And in exchange, we get nothing. We get zero. The other day, I happened, just for the heck of it, to look up the value on Zillow of the home that I grew up in Northern Virginia. And at the time, it was a middle class house. Nice house, but nothing spectacular. It's now a $1.5 million house, and all the houses in that
Wow.
area are now for millionaires. And then I went to looking up the value of the house that I used to own in Loudoun County, which is a little farther out from Fairfax, where I grew up. It's the first house that I bought, and I bought that house back in the 90s for $155,000. That house is now $650,000, and it is a nothing special little tract house on a small lot. And my parents, who were middle class people, my dad was a doctor, couldn't probably afford that house, my old house. Now, forget about, if I go back in time to 20 something me back in the 90s, when I was a single guy in my 20s and I was able to buy that house, there's no way my modern day analog, somebody who is, 25, 26 years old today, could even consider buying a single family house like the one that I used to own. And I think it's tragic and it's dangerous. I think about, why the young people today are so furious about the situation, and they have every right to be. They've been gypped. The thing that I worry about, though, is that a lot of them are going to blame what they consider to be capitalism, and as a result of that, they're going to demand socialism, which will end up impoverishing them and the rest of us even more, unfortunately.
Yeah, you look at the promises that are being made, and I'll just use Zoran Mandami, I believe
Yeah.
is his name, running for mayor in New York City. He's flat out telling them, "Oh, I'm going to make everything just so." He's promising a socialist paradise, and you have to wonder: have any of the people listening to him, any of the people cheering him on, have they ever cracked a history book to see has this been tried somewhere before? How did it work out? Because I can't think of a single instance where those promises were ever actually delivered on, rather than just misery being spread more equally.
Certainly. And I don't think that the government schools, and I'm deliberate in my choice of words there, I don't like to use the word public schools because that's sort of a benign and evasive term. Oh, yeah, they're just open to the public. No, it's a government school. And, the government controls what the kids are taught in those schools. And accordingly, they're really not taught the lessons of socialism. They're not taught what happens when communists come to power. And so instead, they have sort of this soupy, vague idea. Oh, everybody will be just taken care of. We'll all have housing. We'll all have education. We'll all have food. We won't have to grub for a living anymore under this, avaricious system of capitalism that has become almost cartoonish. Now, what we have today really isn't. It's not capitalism. It's corporatism. It's a system in which people at the very apex of this pyramid are able to manipulate and leverage things in a way that you and I cannot because we don't have the means to do it. They've commodified things to get back to that, like a house. A house used to be considered your home. It was a place that you lived in. It wasn't primarily something that was a speculative instrument, something that you bought with the idea of, yeah, I'm gonna hold on to this thing for a year or two, and then I'm gonna flip it, and I'm gonna get $150,000 on my flip, and I'm gonna move on to the next one, and so on. And because that has happened, housing has become extraordinarily expensive, and it is priced young people. Heck, it's priced older people out of the market. I read something a couple of weeks ago that the average age now of the first time buyer of a home is in his 50s. That's just a devastating thing.
Oh, that is. And in interest of full disclosure, my wife and I, we moved a few years ago, knowing that it would probably be a little bit before we could get into a house. We're still waiting. We're still renting. And it's because the home values are, through the stratosphere, and we 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 see our kids agonizing over this thing. Are we ever going to be in a home of our own? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, it's true for me as well. There is no way that I could afford the house I live in now. In fact, a single wide trailer in the area where I live, and I live in a relatively affordable rural part of Southwest Virginia. If you wanted to buy a single wide trailer on an acre of land, you're looking at a $200,000 purchase for something like that.
Unbelievable.
And
Now,
I
I
was going
don't
to
think
say,
that can go on I don't think it can go on indefinitely,
well, it can't
especially.
for a variety of reasons. And I think one of the reasons that it's not going to go on is that it's socially explosive. There is a sense, and it's a legitimate sense of inequity, of unfairness. The idea that, some people got theirs and the rest are kind of excluded. It's like a musical chairs kind of a scenario where some people who were fortunate, got a house when it was still affordable to get a house, and now they're sitting on an asset that's worth a lot of money. And the people who are trying to get into having a house are priced out of the market and forced effectively to rent. Which makes it very difficult. I'm sure you appreciate this, to to save up the money that you need for a down payment. Now, if you're looking at the average price of a house, it's $400,000 in this country. So most mortgages require a 10% down payment. That's $40,000 in cash money. How many people have the wherewithal to save up $40,000 in cash to put it on a down payment? Not many.
Nope, it's not getting better with government intervention. And in fact, I'm going to pivot here just slightly. A lot of the concerns we've heard of, why the government was shut down. I'm putting that in air quotes because they're still taking money out of our paychecks, but it's over the Affordable Care Act. And here you have a perfect example of something that I won't say that healthcare was easily affordable, but it was sure a lot more affordable before the government got involved and started to become the Borg essentially with health providers.
Oh, absolutely. That's become devastatingly expensive. And part of the reason it's so devastatingly expensive is because people can't say no thanks anymore, particularly young people. I've talked about this many times in the past, but one of the reasons I believe that I was able to afford to buy my first house back in the 90s was because I could elect to skip the health insurance that had been offered by my employer at the time. A million years ago, I used to work at the Washington Times, so I was a salaried employee at the Times. And most companies would offer you health insurance. Of course, you paid for that. So however many hundreds of dollars that would come out of my paycheck every month, I thought about that. But I'm 25 years old and I'm athletic. I'm in good shape. I don't have any bad habits. I suppose I could break a leg or something, but the odds of me getting a cancer or heart attack or something like that are essentially nil. So you know what? That's a risk I'm willing to assume. I'd rather have I can't remember exactly what the amount is, but let's say it's $300. The $300 a month back in my pocket that I can put aside and save, for something like a down payment on a house, which is doable on a $155,000 house. You only have to come up with, what, $15,000 or something like that. It's much more doable. Today, they can't do that. They're oppressed by this. And also they've been conditioned to believe, and this is just boggling to me, healthy people in their 20s are made neurotic about the idea that, oh my God, I just couldn't possibly be without health insurance. What might happen? They've been terrorized into believing that they're frail 80-year-old people, who are gonna break a hip tomorrow and are going to be looking at $200,000 worth of bills if they don't get health insurance. It's a catastrophe.
Yep, there's a reason why I've told my wife, if I'm dying of a heart attack, let me go. Collect the insurance money. Do not give it all to a compromised healthcare system that will gladly bleed all of it away from you in a an attempt to keep me breathing long enough to basically take all the money.
Sure. And that's the most despicable aspect of it all. It would be one thing if, in exchange for this exorbitant amount of money that people are being compelled to pay for this health insurance for coverage, they actually did get medical care. But everybody knows, the moment that you file a claim, the moment that you need to have some medical procedure or something done, they will fight you tooth and nail over every little penny and do their very best when you're at your most vulnerable because you're sick. You're trying to deal with the problem that you've got to try to squeeze you for every possible cent they possibly can. And I am not in any way defending old Luigi Mangione or whatever the guy's name was, but I understand. I understand it. And I think that the insurance mafia should think about it because they're playing with fire. What they are doing is so outrageous that people are understandably becoming furious about it. And all of these things are powder kegs. There's so many powder kegs right now in our society, and it would behoove us as a society to consider that and to do what we can to diffuse it.
Agreed. And it's the kind of thing that um, I can see that when the change comes, it's going to be pretty decisive. But I'm looking at the bigger picture of what is government doing in terms of is it getting back in its lane? Because I don't see anything changing in terms of healthcare until the free market is allowed to actually do its job of finding that sweet spot of what people want and what they're willing to pay. But
I agree.
with government involved, it's not going to improve.
Sure. And government is not going to voluntarily excuse itself from this sort of thing. There are too many rice bowls at this point, too much money, too many people are in one way or another dependent or profiting from the system that we have. So it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And so then the question becomes, what can we, each of us on our own, do to insulate ourselves to the extent possible from what is probably coming? And that I think circles us back to what we started the conversation with. It's to find things that are of durable value, that you can possess in your physical sense, that you have in your hand, that you can use when things get rough. And as we've talked about many times in the past, to do everything you can to be as independent of this system, to take care of your health. That's an obvious one. There's so many things that you can do to be healthy so that you don't have to worry about health insurance. I'm not saying that you're not going to get sick, but you can greatly reduce the chances of you becoming sick with something horrible simply by lifestyle choices, by maintaining your decent weight, by exercising. You don't have to be, Sylvester Stallone and go to the gym for 5 hours every day. Just, go for walks, go for runs, do something to keep yourself active and eat decently. Avoid at all costs the processed garbage that they're foisting on us in the grocery store. Eat foods that actually have one ingredient, like eggs,
Yep.
steak, hamburger, that don't have a list this long of what's in them. All those sorts of things you can do that are empowering and will help to counterbalance some of the stuff that we're talking about.
Eric, let's shift gears here for a moment in the closing minutes of our segment. Let's talk a little bit about all things automotive.
Mhm.
I loved your article, charging extra for tires, and this is
Yeah.
another reason why I'm not looking at getting an EV anytime soon. Talk to me about EV manufacturers charging extra for the charging cord, a home
Yeah,
charging cord.
this article was inspired by the vehicle that I'm driving this week, which is a Hyundai Ioniq 5 electric vehicle, and I was very gratified to find that it actually did come with a home charge power cord. And just to give you some context, the last couple of EVs that I've been given to test drive didn't, and that puts you in a really difficult spot because now you're forced to go to one of these commercial fast charging places where, by the way, electricity costs more than gas. That's another story. But in any event, you have to drive to one of these fast charger places and then sit there and wait because you can't charge at home. And I thought this was just remarkably ironic, given that one of the cells, one of the things that they told us when they began pushing EVs was it'll be so convenient. You can charge your EV at home while you're sleeping. Well, you can't do that if you don't have a power cord. So some of these manufacturers, a couple of weeks ago, I had a Volkswagen ID Buzz, which is the electric reincarnation of the old microbus, of the 60s and the 70s. The thing starts at $62,000, and Volkswagen wants $700 extra for the home power cord. It's just nuts. And now another aspect of this that's really interesting to me is the regressiveness of it. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you don't own a single family home, how are you going to home charge your EV? Where are you going to plug it in? You're going to run an extension cord from your apartment or your condo down to the street. You can't do that, even literally can't do it because the gauge of the wire isn't compatible. So,
Wow.
people who are of modest means, who can't afford a single family house or even a townhouse, if they park on the street, they can't charge at home. They're forced to go to these EV fast chargers and pay more for electricity than they would if they just bought a gas engine car and filled the tank.
Yeah, you persuaded me a long time ago, but for those who may be a little slow to get on board, this is stuff you need to consider. Talk to me about some of the other things that you've been testing here of late. Anything in particular that stands out as notable? I know you and I kind of are both wistful about the slowly disappearing V8, but
Yeah.
did I see that was it the Ford Expedition you were testing actually still has a V8?
Um, Expedition does not, unfortunately. It comes with a twin turbo V6 now, as most
Okay.
of these big SUVs do. I'm getting it tomorrow. They're picking up the Ioniq 5 and they're dropping off a Lexus LX 700, which is basically a Lexus-ized version of the Toyota Sequoia, and it too comes with a twin turbo V6 now and a hybrid configuration and no longer a V8. Something that is interesting though that we might talk about briefly, and it's kind of sad. Did you know there's only one truck you can still buy in North America that has a manual transmission? It's the Toyota Tacoma. Jeep no longer offers a manual transmission in the in the Wrangler. That's gone. So the Toyota Tacoma is the last truck standing that you can still get with a manual transmission, but you can only get it in the higher trim models that sticker for $40,000 and up. And it's an interesting metric of the way things have changed. As recently as 2002, 2003, I've got a little Nissan Frontier from back then, and they made a bunch of other different ones like the Ford Ranger and the Tacoma of that time that came standard with standard transmissions. That's what they used to call the manual transmission. And you could buy a truck like my little Frontier brand new for about $12,000. And that's all out the window now. And they, they wonder why people are dead broke and why, car payments are now 6 to 7 years and even going up higher from there.
So talk to me a little bit about the Kia Telluride.
Mhm.
I've wondered about this. Price wise, it seems like actually it may not be a bad deal considering I think you mentioned in your article it comes with a V6,
It does.
but do they hold up? Are they?
Yeah, yeah. Hyundai and Kia actually have got a really good reputation after having not such a good reputation. Back in the '80s when they made models like the Excel, which you and I can remember, the Accent,
Oh yeah.
which were okay. I mean, they were decent little economy cars, but they weren't of the highest quality. Now Hyundai and Kia make really good vehicles, and they're also really good values. I'm glad you brought the Telluride up because it is one of the last remaining vehicles in its class. It's essentially a mid-sized crossover. And if you look at the market segment, you'll find that almost all of them now come with these little turbo hybridized four-cylinder drivetrains. The Telluride still has a just normal V6 engine, which would be an appropriate engine for a 4,000 pound mid-sized crossover slash SUV. That used to be a given in a vehicle like that. And it's not outrageously priced either. Offhand, I can't remember exactly how much, but it's in the mid 30s. I think it's about $35,000 to start. And again, it comes standard with that V6 engine. But be aware, it looks like that next year for the 2026 model year, they're going to update it and they're going to put one of these little four-cylinder turbo hybrid things in,
Uh,
not because the market wants it. Again, the reason all of this is happening, people should understand, is because of the compliance pressure that the vehicle manufacturers are under to eke out fractional gains in mileage and fractional reductions in carbon dioxide, that horrible gas, by putting in these smaller and smaller engines, which are going to cost you significantly more to buy and potentially cost you more down the road to repair because there's just more failure points when you have a drivetrain that consists of a four-cylinder engine with a turbo and then there's a hybrid system attached to that, as opposed to it's a V6 and that's it.
yeah.
There's the V6.
This is why I enjoy my conversations with you because I know we can cover a lot of territory in a pretty short time. Again, talking with Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. Eric, great as always to visit. Looking forward to our talk next week.
Me too, Brian. Thank you.